Hello and welcome to the next series of tutorials from Corona Labs. Corona is a great framework to use to make 2D games, and it's very simple. In fact, you can build and test your game ideas without needing any artwork. Let's start with a very simple game of tic-tac-toe. For this, we'll need to draw some lines on the screen, set up the empty spaces where we can interact with them, either through touch or mouse clicks, and then we need to be able to draw the X's and O's. Let's get started by opening the Corona simulator. On a Macintosh, this will be found in your Applications folder, inside the Corona folder, and then you double click on Corona Simulator. If you're on Windows, this will be in your Start menu. The first time you log in, you may be asked to authorize the app to run on your computer. If so, go ahead and click OK, and then you'll be asked to log in. When you downloaded Corona, you should have been asked to create an account. So let's click OK. If you haven't created an account yet, you can click the register button here and it will take you to a web page where you can create your account. But I'm going to go ahead and log in. And once you're connected, you shouldn't need to do this again unless you intentionally log out or want to change accounts. So let's go ahead and hit New Project. And let's name that project Tic-Tac-Toe. This will create a folder, and we'll get to choose where we create it in a minute. And let's leave all the defaults for what they are, which is basically we're going to start with a blank app. We'll be using a phone preset of 320 by 480. These screen sizes are always specified as if you're holding the phone upright, whether it's upright or sideways. And tic-tac-toe is basically a square game, so it doesn't matter whether we do upright or sideways. But for this demo, let's go ahead and choose upright and click Next. This will bring up a folder, and you can choose where to save it to. So we're going to save it on our desktop and click Create. And then you have the option to Show in Finder, which will bring up a folder of your files, or you can say Open in Editor. We're going to go ahead and open an editor. We have Sublime Text set up as our text editor, and we'll kind of look through some of the files here real quick and see what we've got. If you notice in the background, we have a simulator window, which is currently nothing because our app contains no code, and there's also a console window. This console window will show us any print messages that we create, as well as any errors or warnings that come up along with the use of this. So the folder contains some files that really aren't important at this moment, but they'll be useful later on when you're ready to build for device. And that includes this images XAssets, which is your iOS icons, a launch screen storyboard file, and this will be where you control the iOS launch screens. Build settings will have device-specific settings for when you decide to build for device, so you can set particular things for Android or iOS or desktops. Then you have the various Android icons that you need, and there's a file config.lua that you can use to control your virtual screen size, and we'll talk about that in a future tutorial. But today we're going to focus on our main.lua. Alright, as you notice here, there's already some code in here. There are several lines that begin with 2 hyphens or 2 minus signs. These are comments, and they will not do anything in your code, and this is a useful way for you to document your application. So let's start by putting a title of our game. So let's enter this code. Go to the end, enter a couple of blank lines, and type in local title equals display new text, and then a set of parentheses. Inside the parentheses, you'll have a string. That's these words inside the quote marks. It says tic-tac-toe. Then the next parameter is display content center X, and this tells Corona that you want to center the content. The next parameter is the Y parameter, or how far down the screen you want this label to show up. And basically what we're doing is we're creating a text label. Then we can choose what font we want to use. For this tutorial, we're just going to use native system font bold for everything. This will show in whatever the device's default sans serif font is, and we're going to make it 20 points tall. It's not much code at this point, but let's go ahead and save your code and take a look at the simulator. And you can see there's your label, Tic-Tac-Toe. Now we do have a status bar up here that's typically part of a lot of phones. So you see we might need to move this down a little bit. So let's go back and change our Y position to 25 and hit save. And now, as our simulator updates, it's moved the Tic-Tac-Toe label down a little bit. Now in our code, we gave this variable the word local in front. In Lua, there are two scopes. There's what's called the global scope and the local scope. And these are topics for a much later day. For everything we're going to be doing today, we'll be making all of our variables local, which means they're seen within this particular block of code. Now we need to draw our grid lines. Corona offers a line drawing API, but we're actually going to use a rectangle for this because we will eventually make it rounded rectangles so it'll look a little bit nicer. You could use either, but for fun we're just going to go ahead and use rectangles. So let's enter this code. And again, kind of put it below your title. So we're going to create 4 objects. Left vertical line, right vertical line, top horizontal line, bottom horizontal line. These are all going to be display new rectangles, and we're going to position them based on the center of the screen. So we'll put the left vertical line at display content center X, but we're going to set it 50 points to the left of center. We want to center it on the y-axis, so it's kind of in the middle of the screen vertically. It's going to be 5 pixels wide and 300 pixels tall. We'll do the same for the right vertical line. Again, a display new rectangle. This time we will put it 50 points to the right of content center X, and again centering it 5 pixels tall and 5 pixels wide, 300 pixels tall. For the top and bottom horizontal lines, we'll do the same thing, except this time we want them to be centered in the screen horizontally, but we will position them off of the center of the screen, either minus 50 or plus 50 pixels. So I'll give you a minute to get that typed in. When you're done, go ahead and save your code. And on a Mac, that's Command-S typically, and on Windows, it would be Control-S, depending on your editor. And if we come back over to our simulator, we'll see that we have our grid line updated. So now we have the very basic tic-tac-toe grid set up. The next thing we need to do is we need to make it so that we can interact with these spots. Now, Corona, unlike a lot of programming languages you might be used to, is an event-based system. That means that you don't actually necessarily write a game loop. Instead, you're going to set up event handlers so when something happens, like the user interacts with the app with a touch or a mouse click, or they drag something, or a network event happens, then your code will react to that event and do things. So in this case, we want to set up some spots so that each of these 9 spots on the grid will be able to hold that touch event. Now in Corona, touch events and mouse events are the same thing. If you're on a desktop or in the simulator, touches are done by mouse clicks. If you're on a mobile device, a tablet or a phone, you're going to determine where on the screen was interacted with it by touching it. So first thing we're going to need is a way to track all 9 of these spots. And we're going to do that through a table. And in Lua, tables are simply created as variables. So we'll make it local. We're going to call it spots for each of the spots. And we're going to assign it to be an empty table, which is just the two curly braces. Now, the reason we're doing this is to promote a programming concept called DRY, D-R-Y, or simply don't repeat yourself. By using this table and using a looping construction, we can write the code once to create all 9 spots. And then we'll calculate the positions of each of the spots as we go through our loop. So now that we've got the spots table created, let's add in our next block of code, which will create those spots. So what we have now is a for loop that says we're going to count from 1 to 9. We're going to assign the value of that number to the variable I. I will be a local variable for this for loop. So inside this for loop, I will know whether we're on spot 1 or spot 2 or spot 3 and so on. So the first thing we're going to do is create a display new rectangle. We're going to, for right now, just draw it in the top left corner of the screen. That's the 0, 0. And we're going to make it 90 pixels wide and 90 pixels tall. The next line we're going to call a method setFillColor. And this function will allow you to set the color of your squares. Now, you in your game might want it to go ahead and be black so that they're not necessarily visible. But for our purposes to see what we're doing, it's helpful to give it a little bit of tint. So we're going to say spots, setFillColor, and we'll use the values 0.2, 0.2, and 0.2. Colors in Lua are done based on red, green, blue. So this first value is the red value, the second the green value, and the third the blue value. And there's actually a fourth optional value, which is alpha, which is how transparent the spot is. And then these numbers range from 0 to 1, and it's the percentage of that color that's going to be applied to that square. Next, we're going to set the X and the Y of the rectangle to its appropriate location. When we created our rectangles up here, we went ahead and set the X and Y as part of the constructor for that rectangle. Here, just so we don't end up with some really long lines, it's better to go ahead and set these independently on their own line of code. Now, I've already gone through and worked out the math for these positions. Feel free to put in your own values and play around with them and see how it affects things. All right, and then finally this last line down here is going to create an error for us. And I did this sort of on purpose to show you what errors happen in Lua. So once you go ahead and get your code entered, you can go ahead and pause the video while you type this in, and when you resume, we'll save this and see the error. Okay, we have saved our code now, and it's come up with this error message. Unfortunately, it looks like part of it is cut off on my screen, but basically it says, add event listener. The listener cannot be nil. And it comes down and tells you that it's happening at line 23 in main.lua. If I click on that, it'll also show that same error over in the Corona console. So what caused this error? Well, let's look back at our code. In our add event listener code, we're going to set up a touch handler. And the string touch says that we're going to react to how or when this rectangle is touched. And when it is touched, we're going to call a function called handleMove. Well, we haven't written handleMove yet. So it makes sense that that's going to create an error. Now, since we haven't written that function yet, let's go ahead and comment this out so we won't get our error right now, and we'll come back and fix that later. So go ahead and hit save, and it should relaunch the simulator, and now you can see your gray squares filling the grid. But you still can't click on them or do anything yet. So let's go back to our source code. And the next thing we need to do is fix it so that when we add or touch our spots, we'll either have an X or an O set up. We're going to do this using more display new text. And we're going to use these two lines of code and add them to your loop above the event listener. So the first line that we've added, spots sub I dot move text, we're going to create another display object and add it to spots sub I. But you might be saying spots sub I is my rectangle. That's true, but in Lua and Corona, these objects are actually Lua tables, and you can always extend and add additional members to those tables so that you can kind of keep everything nice and tidy. So spots sub I, our move text will be a display new text. We're going to temporarily draw the number of the spot so we'll know what our spot numbers are. In your live game, you'd probably would to have this just be blank, an empty string such as that, so that nothing shows until it's clicked on. But we're going to go ahead and fill it with the value of I. Now, to easily position these, we're going to use the X and Y positions of the actual rectangle that we've calculated up here above. This allows us to easily center this text inside of our square. In Corona, by default, all positions are the center of the object. So by referencing the center of the rectangle as the center of our text, it'll be nice and centered in between. And again, we'll use native system font bold, but this time we're going to set to something nice and big like 80 points. The next variable, or next item, isn't actually the text itself, but it's a variable member we're going to call move type. And this is where we're going to keep track of whether or not that spot has been clicked on or not. And we'll start by making it nil, indicating that it's not been clicked on. So go ahead and save your code. And like I said, go ahead and pause this while you type it in if you're necessary. I'm going to go ahead and save and come back and look at our screen. And there are our numbers showing our grid spots. So grid 1 is the top left corner. Spot 9 is the bottom right corner. 5 is the center. So this will be kind of useful later when you need to put in some additional logic to determine the game winner. All right, so now let's go ahead and add in some game logic so that we can actually click on these spots and have things happen. One of the first things you need to understand about Lua, in particular if you're coming from a different language like C, is that Lua is a single pass compiler. That is, all variables and functions have to be known before you can use them. In C, you might write your main function first and then all your other functions lower in the code. In C, it will actually go through and says, okay, these are all my functions and variables, and it comes back in a second pass and assigns all the addresses to everything. In Lua, it's one pass, so everything has to be defined first. So to get this to work, we're going to need to add a little bit of code, and we'll need to do it more toward the top. So somewhere near the top, probably below where we created the grid, like where we created the spots, open up a blank line and add in the line local player equals and put X inside of quotes. In Tic-Tac-Toe, player X always goes first. We'll put a little comment in there so that you can get used to commenting your code as we go along. Now we're going to use this variable in a little bit to track who the current player is. Just below the spot and somewhere above the for loop, we need to now add our function that will handle the move or the touch events. So let's go ahead and create our handle move function. so that we can react to when the screen is touched or the mouse is clicked. So we're going to use this code to do that. So it's going to be a local variable, or this time it's a function. It's going to be named handle move, and inside the parentheses is the parameters that are passed to it. If you're writing your own function, you may need multiple parameters. But in this particular case, all event functions will always get a single object passed to them, and that is a table of information about the event. What the event type is, where it happened, what's going on with it, and so on. And you can use that information to make decisions inside of your function. Now with touch events, there's going to be a value pass called event.phase. And this is basically what's going on with the touch. Did somebody start a touch or click the mouse button? Did they let up on the mouse button or pick their finger up off the device? And so on. So the begin phase means they started the click or started the touch. If they've let their finger up or let the mouse up, you'll get an ended phase. If they move their finger around or move the mouse around while the button is still being pressed or while the finger's still down, you'll get an event phase of moved. For this game, we just really care to know when the event started happening, so we'll just test to see if the event phases began. That means somebody has clicked on a spot. The next line inside the if statement, and notice that for every if, there's a closing end statement. So we're going to have another if inside of here that's going to test this variable called event.target. This may look a little strange, but this is actually a really cool feature of how Corona events work. In this function, you don't know which of your 9 squares was clicked on, because somebody could have clicked on any of them. So we need to know which one was clicked on. Event.target will be the spot that was clicked on. So down here we created our spots and we attached the touch handler to them. So if somebody clicked on spots sub 9, the 9th spot, event.target will be spot sub 9. So you can use that as a generic reference to whichever spot was clicked on, and then we have access to all of the variables that we have set up for that. So for instance, .move type equals nil. So we're testing to see if that spot has not been clicked on yet. That maps down here to where we set spot sub I equals nil. Now, in Lua, like many languages, a single equal sign is to assign a value to a variable. In logic tests like if statements and while loops, 2 equals is testing to see if the two values are equal to each other. So if the spot has not been used before, we're going to test to see if the current player is X, which it currently is. If so, we're going to set our event target, which is the spot we clicked on, our display new text that we created, and it has its own attribute called text. And this is the actual string that will show on the screen. So we set that to player. And this is what's going to cause either the X or the O to show up. We also go ahead and set our move type to the player. That way we know that spot's been clicked on. In which case if we come in and it's not nil, then we will not execute any of this code. Now if player is not X, well, before we get there, since this was player X, we now set player to O, so we'll know that'll be the next player. In the else condition, we'll go ahead and set it to the player and set the move type to the player and change the player to X. This probably could be simplified a little bit further, but for now this will be enough. Finally, it's very important that when you handle a touch operation in Corona or any event, you return true so the operating system knows that that event was handled and it doesn't get passed on to some other object. So now that we have our handle move function, we can come down to our loop, take the comments out on our add event listener, and go ahead and save your code. Go ahead and pause it while you type the code in, and then when you come back, we will come over and see this in action. Okay, now that you've got your code entered, let's come back over to the simulator, and we still see our numbers. But now if we click on a spot, the first time it should show X. The next time it should show an O. Then you can do another X and click another O. And then you can keep doing this to make your moves, and eventually you'll get your 3 X's in a row and the player has won. Now at this point you've got a fairly playable game. However, there's more that needs to be done. We need to add in additional logic to know that this X has won this game. We also need to know if the game's a stalemate. And you notice I can't come back in here and click on spots, but I can come in and fill out the empty spots because we've not indicated the game's over yet. So in part 2 of this tutorial, we'll come back and complete this game and add in the rest of the logic. So hopefully for now you've seen how easy Corona is to create a very quick and simple game with some pretty powerful logic to handle touch and mouse click events and be able to get off to your first start of creating your game.